"Mom, you can't teach US morality." He said it right there, in the middle of the toast. My son, Mark. The crystal glass was raised in his hand, a perfect imitation of a gentleman, but the words just hung in the air. They were heavy, ugly. They landed, and everything else stopped. The murmur of conversation, the clink of silverware, even the soft music from the speakers seemed to hold its breath. I could hear a fork scrape against a plate somewhere to my left, a single, sharp sound, in a suddenly vast silence. He was smiling when he said it. That was the part that broke something. It wasn't a flash of anger, a heated word in an argument. It was a performance, calculated. He held his smile, letting everyone in that room, our family, our friends, people I'd known for 50 years, turn and look at me. He wanted them to see my reaction. He was waiting for the tears, I think, or for me to crumble. But I didn't cry. Crying is warm. What happened inside me was the opposite of warmth. It was a sudden, violent freeze. I felt the blood in my veins turn to slush. A lifetime of maternal softness, of excuses and forgiveness just crystallized. It became something hard and sharp and terribly, terribly clear. It wasn't diamond. Diamond is precious. This was ice, the kind that splits rock. My gaze went past my son, past the smug, practiced confidence on his face, and I saw her, Chloe, his wife, standing just behind his shoulder, her hand resting on his arm. Her expression was one of perfect, sympathetic concern, a mask she wore so well, but her eyes were gleaming. It was the look of a general watching a cannonball hit its target, and in that instant, the whole ugly picture clicked into place. This wasn't his arrow, it was hers. He was just the bow. The silence couldn't last. Someone coughed, a nervous, shuffling sound. The party, my 70th birthday party, the one I had paid for down to the last champagne flute and orchid, tried to restart itself, but the heart had been ripped out of it. The laughter that followed was brittle. The conversations were strained. My eyes drifted away from their triumphant faces and landed on the center of the head table, on the croquembouche, a tower of cream-filled puffs spun with golden caramel reaching for the ceiling. It had taken me 5 hours that morning. I remember the feeling of the caramel, dangerously hot, as I spun it into delicate threads. I remembered the patience it took to place each puff just so, building the structure, making sure it was strong, balanced, and beautiful. A little monument. For them. For this family I thought I'd built with the same care. Piece by piece, over a lifetime, it stood there now. Perfect and gleaming under the chandeliers, untouched. No one had taken a single piece. It was no longer a celebration. It was a cenotaph, a memorial to something that was dead and didn't even know it. I felt a small, almost imperceptible tremor in my hand. I looked down at it, lying on the white linen tablecloth. An old hand, spotted with age, but steady. The tremor wasn't weakness. It was power humming to life. Slowly, deliberately, I reached for my handbag on the floor beside my chair. It's a simple leather bag, one my late husband, Richard, gave me decades ago. The leather is soft as butter. Inside, my fingers found what I was looking for. My notebook, a small black leather-bound book, also a gift from him, and my pen. Not a cheap plastic thing, but a fountain pen. Heavy, solid. It made a soft, satisfying click when I uncapped it. I placed the notebook on the table, right next to my untouched plate of food. I opened it to a fresh page. The paper was thick, creamy. The conversations around me faltered again, people watching me with confused, wary eyes. I ignored them. I was no longer in that room. I was somewhere else entirely, a place of cold accounting. I looked up, letting my eyes sweep across the guests. My gaze settled on Mark's college friend Jerry, who was now nodding at him with a conspiratorial smirk. I looked down at the paper. The pen touched the page, and with a steady hand I drew a small, perfect square. I filled it in with black ink. My eyes moved on. To my cousin, Sarah, who had always been so jealous. She was whispering to her husband, her hand covering her mouth, but her eyes were dancing with malice. I drew another square next to the first, filled it in. 2. Mark and Chloe were watching me now. I could feel their stare. I glanced up and saw it, the flicker of confusion in his eyes, but on her face there was a new expression, the faintest trace of alarm. She thought this was a sign of senility, of a mind finally cracking under pressure. She thought I was lost. She had no idea that I had never been more found. I looked at my sister, Eleanor. She sat beside me, her face pale with fury on my behalf. She knew the truth of that old story Mark had twisted into a weapon. Her hand slid across the table and covered mine. A silent plea. "Don't, Lydia, don't do this. You're better than them." I appreciated the gesture. I truly did. But the woman she was trying to save was already gone, frozen to death a few minutes ago. I gently, very gently, slid my hand out from under hers and continued my work. I drew a third square for an old business associate of Richard's who looked away the moment my eyes met his. Ashamed, perhaps, but shame wasn't enough. Not anymore. My granddaughter, Ella, Mark, and Chloe's daughter, was staring at me from across the table. She wasn't looking at me with confusion or pity. She was looking with sheer, unadulterated horror. Her face was white. Her eyes were wide, and in them, I saw what Mark had just killed. Respect. Innocence. She wasn't looking at her grandmother having a breakdown. She was watching a queen being deposed, and she was terrified of what would rise in her place. She understood, on some deep, intuitive level, that this notebook wasn't a sign of madness. It was a ledger. I kept going. 1 square for the neighbor who patted Mark's shoulder in solidarity. Another for his brother-in-law who raised his glass a second too late. His toast a hollow echo of my son's. Each square was a name, a face, a moment of betrayal, small or large, now recorded. It wasn't an act of anger. Anger is messy. This was architecture. I was drafting the blueprints for a new world, a world with different foundations. The pain was still there, of course. It was a vast, cold ocean beneath the ice, but my mind was no longer drowning in it. It was skating on the surface, moving with speed and precision. I wasn't feeling the hurt anymore. I was documenting it. Each black square was a nail I was hammering into the coffin of the life I'd had before that toast. Each one was a promise to myself. Never again would my love, my money, my life's work be used as a weapon against me. The party finally, mercifully, sputtered to an end. Guests left with hurried goodbyes and averted eyes. They couldn't get out of that room fast enough. Soon, it was just the family. Mark approached the table, his bravado returning now that his audience was gone. "Well, Mother," he said, trying for a light tone. "Quite the evening." I didn't look up from my notebook. I just drew another square, a larger one, in the center of the page. I began to fill it in, the scratching of the nib on the paper the only sound in the room. He watched me for a moment, waiting for a response. When none came, he cleared his throat and left with Chloe, her hand now gripping his arm a little too tightly. I stayed there long after they were all gone. The staff cleared the tables around me, moving with quiet efficiency, but they didn't touch my table. They left me with my cold tea, my untouched tower of lies, and my notebook. It was almost full now, a constellation of black shapes on a cream-colored sky, a map of my new reality. It wasn't a plan for revenge. Revenge is a hot, emotional thing. This was a correction, a rebalancing of the books, and I knew, with a certainty that chilled me to the bone, that my first phone call in the morning would be to my lawyer, Mr. Harrison. He was an old friend. He would understand the geometry of what I was doing. He would know exactly how to help me build it. And stash, and trust. I didn't sleep. Sleep is a surrender, a letting go. I did not have that luxury. The ice that had formed inside me did not melt in the silent, empty hours before dawn. If anything, it grew harder, clearer. I sat in the dark of my kitchen, the hulking silhouette of the croquembouche on the table before me, a monument to a world that no longer existed. It looked obscene in the sterile morning light. At exactly 8 a.m., I picked up the phone. I did not have to look up the number. Harrison and Lowe. The voice was young, efficient. Lydia Hale for Mr. Harrison, I said. My own voice sounded strange to me, lower, duller, like a stone rolling across other stones. There was a pause. Of course, Mrs. Hale. One moment. The line clicked. Then a voice I had known for 40 years, a voice that had mourned with me, celebrated with me, and advised me, came on the line. Lydia, is everything all right? Good morning, James, I said, my tone perfectly level. Everything is precisely as it should be. I will be at your office at 9. We need to redraft the family trust and my will immediately. James Harrison was a man who understood the weight of words. He didn't ask questions. He didn't offer condolences for whatever had prompted this call. He simply said, I'll be ready. I hung up the phone. My eyes fell on the black notebook lying beside it. It was my map now. I put on a simple navy blue dress, the kind I wore to board meetings. I did my hair. I put on my pearls. This was not a day for grieving clothes. This was a day for business. The first step to freedom was legal. James's office smelled of old leather, lemon polish, and paper. It was a scent of permanence, of things that endured. He stood when I entered, his expression grave but calm. He had seen everything in his 60 years of practicing law. My personal earthquake was, to him, another file to be handled with discretion and expertise. Tea, Lydia. No. Thank you, James. Let's begin. He nodded, gesturing for me to sit. The documents were already waiting on the vast mahogany desk that had belonged to his father. For an hour, we worked. The language was cold, precise, stripped of all sentiment. Beneficiary, stipulation, breach of fiduciary duty, discretionary distribution. We built a new fortress of words. The old trust, the one built on the assumption of love and natural succession, was dissolved. A new one was born. I named it the Hale Foundation. Its new terms were simple. Funds would be allocated not based on bloodline, but on merit and demonstrated character, to be assessed by a board of trustees. My board of trustees. My granddaughter Ella was named the sole future heir, but only upon completion of her university degree and 5 years of charitable work. Mark and Chloe were not mentioned. Their names were simply gone. When it was all done, James slid the final signature pages toward me. My hand was steady as I signed my name. Lydia Hale. It looked different on this document, stronger. It is done, James said, his voice soft. Not quite, I replied, looking up at him. There is one more thing. He raised an eyebrow. Richard's seal, I said. The old one, with the family crest. You keep it in the safe, don't you? A flicker of understanding crossed his face. He nodded slowly. Of course. He went to the large, black safe tucked behind a painting of a clipper ship. I heard the tumblers click. He returned with a small, heavy brass seal and a stick of dark red wax. He lit a candle on his desk, the flame dancing in the quiet room. He didn't ask why. He understood. This wasn't about legal necessity. It was about authority. I took the stick of wax and held it to the flame, letting the molten red drip onto the page right next to my signature, a perfect blood-red circle. Then I took the seal. It was heavy in my hand, the familiar weight of my husband's legacy. I pressed it firmly into the cooling wax. The crest a lion holding a compass imprinted itself, a symbol of strength and direction. When I lifted it, the mark was perfect, final, irrevocable. I was no longer just the widow, the grieving matriarch. I was the head of the family. This was not an act of anger. It was a coronation. The second step was financial. From James's office, I went directly to the main branch of the bank. It was a cold, cavernous place with marble floors that echoed with every step. I was met not by a teller, but by the bank president himself, a man whose father I'd known. He ushered me into his glass-walled office with an air of practiced reverence. "Mrs. Hale, what a pleasure. How can we help you today?" I placed my new documents on his desk. "I am here to close the Hale Family Trust. Account number 738B. All assets are to be liquidated and transferred to a new holding account for the Hale Foundation." His smile faltered. He looked at the documents, then back at me. "Close it? But the automatic allowances for your son, Mark, the corporate accounts he has access to, all of it," I said. The ice in my voice made him flinch. "I want every credit line, every card, every access point linked to that trust severed, effective immediately." For the next hour, he and his assistants scurried. I sat in his plush chair, my hands folded in my lap, and I watched. I watched as they typed furiously into their computers. I listened to the quiet, urgent phone calls. I imagined the exact moment when Mark, likely at a leisurely lunch with Chloe, would hand his platinum card to a waiter, only to be told it was declined. I imagined the flush of confusion, then annoyance, then dawning panic. I felt nothing, no satisfaction, no glee, just the quiet, grinding finality of a great machine coming to a halt. When the last transaction was confirmed, the bank president turned back to me, his face a mixture of awe and fear. "It's done, Mrs. Hale. The old trust is empty." "Thank you," I said, standing up. I walked out of the bank, the doors hissing shut behind me. I had not destroyed his inheritance. I had simply taken it back. It had always been mine. The third and final step was personal. It was the one that mattered most. I didn't drive home. I drove to the family estate, the large stone house just outside the city where Mark and his family lived. The house my husband and I had built, and which I had gifted to them 5 years ago. As I approached the great iron gates, I saw it. To the right of the entrance, affixed to the stone pillar, was a bronze plaque, polished, proud. It read, "The residence of Mark Hale and family," his name, on my stone. I pulled the car over. I took out my phone and called a number I had in my old contacts. A man named Mr. Petrov, a stonemason. "Mr. Petrov," I said when he answered. "Lydia Hale, I have a job for you at the old Hale estate on Mill Road. I need a bronze nameplate removed from the front gate pillar." "Removed, Mrs. Hale?" he asked, his voice thick with a Slavic accent. "Is it to be replaced?" "No," I said. "It is to be removed. I want you to take it off and leave nothing but the stone. Can you do it today?" "Yes, ma'am. I can be there in an hour. I will wait," I said, and hung up, and I did. I sat in my car, parked across the road, and watched. I watched as his small, dusty truck pulled up. I watched as the old man, his hands thick and calloused, got out his tools. He looked at the plaque, then over at my car, and gave a slight, respectful nod. He understood he was being observed. I didn't look away. I watched him work the chisel under the edge of the bronze. I heard the sharp, grating sound of metal on stone. It was a terrible sound, like a bone being broken. With each tap of his hammer, a piece of Mark's assumed identity was being pried away. This nameplate wasn't just a sign. It was a statement of ownership, of entitlement. He had not earned this house. He had been given it, and he had defiled the gift. Finally, with a loud scraping noise, the plaque came free. Mr. Petrov held it in his hands for a moment, then carried it to his truck. He didn't even try to clean the pillar. He didn't have to. He drove away, leaving me staring at the gate. The stone was lighter where the plaque had been, a pale, rectangular scar. It was uglier than the plaque itself. It was a wound. It showed that something had been there, and had been forcibly, deliberately cut away. Good, I thought. Let it be a lesson. Let everyone who passes see the scar and wonder what treason was committed here. Only then did I drive home. My home. The house felt different. The silence was not the silence of absence but of ownership. It was mine again. My eyes fell on the croquembouche, still standing on the kitchen table, a relic of a forgotten war. I walked over to it. Slowly, piece by piece, I began to dismantle it. I did not eat a single puff. I took them, one by one, and dropped them into the waste bin, until there was nothing left but a sticky, caramel-smeared plate. I washed the plate, dried it, and put it away. I looked at my hands. They were clean. The day's work was done. The house was in order. Maître. The silence in my house was a physical presence. It was not the gentle, comforting quiet of a peaceful morning. It was the profound, absolute stillness that follows a controlled demolition. The structure of my old life was gone, and this silence was the dust settling. I had spent the day before laying the charges and pressing the detonator. Now, I was simply waiting for the shockwave to hit. It began, as I knew it would, with the phone. It was just after noon. The phone, sitting on the polished surface of the hall table, began to vibrate, a low, angry hum. Then it rang, a shrill, demanding sound that sliced through the quiet. The screen lit up with his name, Mark. I did not move. I was in the living room, reading a book. I heard the ring, acknowledged it, and turned the page. It rang 12 times, then stopped. The silence that rushed back in was deeper, more charged than before. 30 seconds later, it started again, and again, and again. It was a siege. A frantic, digital banging on a door I had no intention of opening. He was a child, locked out of the candy store, unable to comprehend that the locks had been changed. Then came the texts. My phone, which I'd set on the table beside me, began to ping. A different front in the same useless war. The first was pure confusion. Mom? My card was declined. Call me. The second, 5 minutes later, was laced with irritation. Mom, this isn't funny. I'm at lunch. Call me now. The third was from Chloe, an attempt at a pincer movement. Lydia, Mark is very upset. We're all worried about you. Please pick up the phone. I read them all with a detached curiosity. It felt like reading telegrams from a distant, chaotic country I no longer lived in. Their panic felt foreign, their urgency irrelevant. The calls and texts continued for hours, a barrage of entitlement and manufactured concern. They were throwing everything they had at the wall, expecting it to crumble as it always had before. They didn't understand. There was no wall anymore. There was just a void. At 4 o'clock, after the 20th missed call, I decided it was time. Not because I was worn down, but because the next phase required a clear, unequivocal message. I waited for the phone to ring again. When it did, I picked it up on the second ring. I said nothing. Mother? He screamed. The word was distorted with rage. What the hell is going on? What did you do? I held the phone a few inches from my ear. listening to the raw, unfiltered tantrum of a 45-year-old man who had just had his allowance taken away. My accounts are frozen. Chloe's card was declined at Neiman Marcus. The bank president called me, babbling about some foundation. Are you senile? Have you lost your mind? I waited. I could hear his ragged breathing on the other end of the line. He was pacing. I could picture it, running a hand through his hair, his face red and blotchy, just like it used to get when he was 4 and I told him he couldn't have another cookie. Chloe would be in the background, her face a mask of anxious support, mouthing words at him. Ask her about the trust. Ask her about the house. And the nameplate, he shrieked, his voice cracking. You had the goddamn nameplate taken off the gate. What is wrong with you? After everything we've done for you, after we've been looking after you. He trailed off, finally running out of steam. The silence he left behind was heavy, pathetic. He was waiting for me to scream back, to cry, to justify myself, to engage, to give him a fight he could understand. I let the silence stretch for a full 10 seconds. I wanted him to feel it. I wanted him to understand that the rules of engagement had fundamentally, irrevocably changed. Then I spoke. My voice was calm, quiet, and as cold as the marble floor of the bank. Mark, I said, and the simple sound of his name, spoken in that dead tone, made him draw a sharp breath. From now on, all questions go through Mr. Harrison. You know the number. And I hung up. I didn't slam the phone down. I pressed the red icon on the screen with the tip of my finger. A soft, final click. The line was dead. I placed the phone face down on the table. It was over. I had not engaged. I had not argued. I had simply delegated him. I had taken our messy, painful, emotional relationship and turned it into a piece of paperwork. He was no longer my son in any practical sense. He was a legal matter to be handled by my attorney. The shock of that realization, I knew, would be far more devastating than any angry words I could have hurled at him. He and Chloe had wanted a war. I had just informed them they were nothing more than a minor clerical issue. I went into the kitchen and made myself a cup of tea. My hands were perfectly steady. The house was quiet again, but this time it was a victorious silence. An hour later, a different sound came from my study. A soft, almost forgotten ping. It was my old laptop, the one I rarely used anymore. It was the sound of an email. Curiosity, a feeling I thought had been frozen solid, stirred within me. I walked into the study and opened the laptop. There was one new message. It wasn't from Mark or Chloe. The sender was simply Ella. There was no subject line. I clicked it open. There were no words, just a single, scanned image. It was a child's drawing, done in crayon. A lopsided house with a smiling sun in the corner. 2 stick figures stood outside. One was tall, with a triangle dress and wild yellow hair. Me. The other was tiny, holding the tall figure's hand. Her. Across the top, in clumsy backward letters, was written, Grammy and me. Beneath the drawing, she had typed a single word. Remember. The ice around my heart did not melt, but for the first time, I felt its crushing weight. This was a different kind of communication. It wasn't a demand for money or an accusation. It was a question about love. It had bypassed the corporate firewalls and legal barricades I had erected and struck at something much older, much deeper. My first instinct was to delete it, to protect myself. She was their daughter. This could be another, more sophisticated manipulation, a weaponized memory sent by Chloe. But I looked closer at the drawing. I remembered the day she drew it. We had been sitting on the floor of my sunroom. She was 5 years old. Her tongue stuck out in concentration as she pressed the wax crayon to the paper. The memory was pure. It was real. It existed in a time before the calculation and the greed had poisoned everything. My fight was with my son and his wife. It was with the people they had become. But this child, this young woman, she was a casualty, not a combatant. To punish her for their sins would be to become as cruel as they were. I took a deep breath. My fingers, which had been so decisive all day, hesitated over the keyboard. I could not offer her the old warmth. That was gone. But I could offer her a path, a chance. I clicked reply. I did not write about the party. I did not write about her father. I did not answer her question directly. I typed a new set of terms. A new meeting place, on neutral ground. The Bluebird Cafe. Tomorrow, 3 p.m. I hit send. The message was gone. It was an invitation, but it was also a test. Would she come? And more importantly, would she come alone? I closed the laptop. Mr. Harrison's name was the wall I had built to keep the barbarians out. The address of that cafe was a small, guarded gate. I was now the gatekeeper, and I would be the one to decide who, if anyone, was ever allowed back in. Never Keter. The Bluebird Cafe was a small, unassuming place that smelled of roasted coffee beans and old books. I chose it for its neutrality. It held no memories for us, no ghosts. When Ella walked in, she looked fragile, like a young bird caught in a storm. She clutched a book to her chest like a shield and scanned the room with wide, nervous eyes. When she saw me, a wave of something relief, or perhaps fear, washed over her face. She slid into the booth opposite me. For a long moment, she just stared at her hands on the table. "Grandmother," she began, her voice barely a whisper. I am so sorry." I did not soften. The ice was a necessary armor. "For what, precisely, are you sorry?" The question was blunt, clinical. She flinched. "For what Dad said. For all of it. It was cruel. It was wrong." She looked up, and her eyes, so like her father's, but without the weakness, were filled with a genuine, agonizing shame. "I wanted you to know that I don't think that. That I know who you are." "Do you?" I asked, my voice still level. Instead of answering, she pushed the book she was holding across the table. It was an old, worn copy of Jane Eyre. My copy. I used to read it to her when she was a little girl. Tucked inside the cover was the crayon drawing she had sent me, Grammy and me. "I remember," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "I remember everything. You taught me to read with this book. You told me Jane was strong because she had a core of principle that no one could take from her. You said that was more important than money or houses or what other people thought." Her eyes pleaded with me. "Please don't let them take that from you." That was the moment. The first crack in the ice. Not a melt, but a hairline fracture. She hadn't come to ask for money. She hadn't come to plead her parents' case. She had come to defend a memory, to defend my principles, to remind me of the woman I had taught her to be. I looked at her, truly looked at her, and I saw a foundation, one that was strong and true and well built. I had thought the entire structure had to be condemned, but I was wrong. A part of it was sound, the most important part. I pushed the book gently back toward her. "Keep it," I said, "and read it again. There are lessons in there for a young woman who is about to build her own life." I paid for her coffee, told her to work hard at university, and left. I did not hug her. I did not offer warmth I no longer possessed, but I had given her something more important, a future. And in doing so, I had found the purpose for my own. The next morning, Mr. Harrison called. "Lydia," he said, his voice weary. "Mark has been persistent. He's threatening legal action. He's talking about competency hearings. It's nonsense, of course, but it will be ugly." "He is a cornered animal, James," I said. "He will bite and scratch. That is what they do. He and Chloe are demanding a meeting. They refuse to speak with me any longer. They insist on seeing you." I looked around the room I was in. It wasn't my house. A few days after the party, I had signed a lease on a space downtown. A large, open-plan studio with white walls, concrete floors, and a massive wall of windows that flooded the room with clean, bright light. It was the opposite of the dark wood and heavy draperies of my old life. It smelled of potential. "All right, James," I said. "Tell them they can have their meeting. My office. Tomorrow at 10. There was a pause. "Your office?" "Yes," I said. "I'll send you the address." They arrived at 10 on the dot. I watched them from my drafting table as they stepped out of the elevator. They were dressed for war. Mark in a severe dark suit, Chloe in a sheath dress that cost more than my first car. Her hair, a perfect helmet. They had come expecting to find me in a dimly lit drawing room, surrounded by memories, a grieving widow they could bully or manipulate. Instead, they found themselves in my world. They stopped just inside the door, blinking in the bright light, looking utterly out of place. The room was dominated by a single, enormous white table, upon which were spread vast sheets of architectural paper, covered in crisp black lines. T-squares, compasses, and technical pens lay in neat, orderly rows. I was standing over it, a pencil in my hand, my back to them. I did not turn around. I did not greet them. I simply continued my work. "Mother," Mark's voice was tight, strained. He was trying to sound authoritative, but the unfamiliar space had already stolen his power. I drew a long, clean line along the edge of a ruler. The soft scratch of graphite on paper was the only sound. "We are here to talk about what you've done," he said, taking a step forward. Chloe remained by the door, her eyes darting around the room, assessing, calculating. This was not the battlefield she had prepared for. "You've lost your mind," Mark's voice rose, cutting me off, embarrassing Chloe, trying to turn my own daughter against me. This madness has to stop." I still didn't look at him. I leaned closer to the blueprint, examining a specific point where two load-bearing walls would meet. I made a small, precise mark. "I am building a public library, Mark," I said, my voice conversational, calm. "The cornerstone will be laid in the spring, right here." I tapped the mark with the tip of my pencil. "This is the foundation. It's the most important part. You build it wrong, and the whole structure is worthless. It will collapse under the slightest pressure." I paused, then added, without a trace of emotion, "You destroyed yours." The words hit him like a physical blow. He was speechless. He had come armed for a screaming match, and I had answered with a metaphor about concrete. Chloe finally moved. She glided forward, her heels clicking on the polished floor. She placed herself in my line of sight, forcing me to acknowledge her. Her voice, unlike Mark's, was smooth and coated in venom. "This is a game to you, isn't it?" she said. "All of this. Freezing accounts, changing your will. You're doing it to punish us." I finished shading a section of the plan. Then, slowly, I put down my pencil and straightened up. I turned and looked at her. For the first time, I let my gaze rest on them both. They looked small in the vast, bright room. Their expensive clothes looked like costumes. I felt a strange sense of detachment, the way a scientist might observe two specimens under a microscope. "Punish you?" I repeated, my voice filled with a cold, genuine curiosity. The thought seemed absurd, a waste of energy. "No, that would imply you are still a factor in my emotional life." I let that sink in. I have simply divested from underperforming assets. It was a business decision. You and Mark were a bad investment, Chloe. You yielded no returns, only liabilities. So, I liquidated the position. It's really quite simple. I used their language, the brutal, transactional language of money and power they understood so well, and it broke them. Chloe's mask of composure shattered. Her face contorted in a brief, ugly flash of pure fury before she smoothed it over again. Mark just stared, his mouth slightly open. He had been prepared to fight for his inheritance. He had no idea how to fight for his status as a rentable asset. You can't just erase us," he stammered. "I am your son. You are a man who used his mother's most painful secret to try and shame her for money at a party she paid for," I said, my voice flat and final. "The biological fact of our relation is no longer relevant. I turned back to my drafting table. I picked up my pencil. I had given them their meeting. Now it was over. My attention was already elsewhere, on the clean lines and logical certainties of my blueprint. On the future, James will be in touch regarding the removal of your remaining personal effects from the estate, I said to their backs. Now, if you'll excuse me, I have a library to design. I did not watch them leave. I heard the click-clack of Chloe's heels in retreat, the sound of the elevator doors opening and closing, and then silence. But it was not the silence of demolition. It was the quiet, hopeful, industrious silence of a construction site, just before the real work begins. I took a deep breath. It tasted like freedom. I drew the next line. It was perfect. The restaboat. The meeting in my new office was the end of a chapter. Not the end of the book, but the final declarative sentence that allows the reader to turn the page. I never saw or spoke to Mark and Chloe again. Mr. Harrison handled the logistics, the dry, legal process of disentanglement. They were a file in his cabinet, a series of signed papers, and then they were nothing. They had not been erased from history, but they had been removed from my future. The scar on the stone pillar at their gate was the only epitaph their memory deserved. The silence that followed their departure from my life was not empty. It was spacious. For the first time in decades, I had room to think. My new apartment was a testament to that space. It was a large, top-floor residence in a restored historical building, with high ceilings and tall windows that looked out over the city park. The walls were white. The floors were a pale, polished oak. It had no history, no ghosts in the hallways, no carpets worn down by the footsteps of people who no longer deserved to be remembered. It was a blank page. And the first thing I did was not to fill it with the past. The moving company had delivered the boxes, stacked them neatly against the walls. Boxes of books, of clothes, of the few pieces of furniture I had deemed worthy of keeping. But I didn't open them. Instead, I went to the one box I had carried myself. It was long and narrow, made of old, dark wood. Inside, nestled in velvet, were my late husband's drafting tools. Richard had been an architect. Not just a man who designed buildings, but a man who believed that a well-designed space could shape a life. I took out the single most important tool, a heavy steel tape measure. It felt solid and real in my hand. I walked to the longest, brightest wall in the main room. I hooked the end of the tape to the baseboard and walked backwards, the thin metal ribbon unspooling with a soft whirring sound. 28 feet. I made a small pencil mark on the wall. I measured the height. 12 feet. I began to map out the room, my movements slow and deliberate. This was not unpacking. This was an act of creation. In my mind, I was not just measuring a wall. I was laying the foundation for the heart of my new life. This entire wall would be a library, floor-to-ceiling shelves built from light wood with a rolling ladder. It would be a space not for display, but for use, a workshop for the mind. My home was no longer a stage for family gatherings. It was a sanctuary for thought. For the first time in so long, I felt the pure, simple joy of planning something for myself. I wasn't a wife, or a mother, or a hostess. I was an architect of my own peace. A week later, the doorbell rang. I wasn't expecting anyone. I opened it to find Ella standing there. She looked different. The nervous fragility was gone, replaced by a quiet composure. In her hands, she held not a childhood drawing, but a large, beautifully bound book. "Grandmother," she said, her voice steady. "I hope I'm not intruding." "Come in, Ella," I said, stepping back. She entered, her eyes taking in the empty rooms, the stacks of boxes, the pencil marks on the walls. She didn't see chaos. I could tell she saw potential. "I brought you something," she said, holding out the book. "A housewarming gift." I took it. It was heavy. The title, embossed in gold leaf, read, "The Poetics of Space, on Light and Form in Modern Architecture." It was a rare first edition copy. Something I had mentioned wanting in passing years ago. I had been searching for it for over a decade. I looked from the book to her face. My son and his wife had showered me with expensive, thoughtless gifts for years, cashmere throws, when I lived in a warm climate. Jewelry I never wore. They gave me things they thought a wealthy old woman should have. Ella had given me a piece of my own soul, something she had listened to, remembered, and sought out. "Thank you, Ella," I said, and my voice was softer than it had been in weeks. "This is a remarkable gift. I thought it might be useful for your new project," she said, nodding toward the plans for the library that were now spread across my drafting table. "The big one." I led her over to the table. We stood there for a moment in silence, looking down at the blueprints for the new public library. "He would have loved this," she said quietly, tracing the line of the main reading room with her finger. "Grandfather." "Yes," I said. "He believed a library was a city's conscience." We didn't speak of the party. We didn't speak of her parents. The past was a closed book. We were standing firmly in the present, looking at a blueprint for the future. "What's this section for?" she asked, pointing to a curved wing on the building's north side. "That," I said, feeling a new energy rise in me, "is the children's wing. The ceiling will be a high dome, painted like the night sky, with fiber optic stars that correspond to the actual constellations. The light has to be just right, soft, indirect. You want them to feel like they are in a magical, safe place. You see how I've positioned the windows here, facing east? They'll get the gentle morning light, but will be shielded from the harsh afternoon Sunday." I found myself explaining the principles of design, the way form must follow function, the way a building must breathe and interact with its environment. She listened, her attention absolute, her questions intelligent. She asked about stress loads, about acoustics, about the choice of materials. I was no longer the matriarch, the keeper of the family fortune. I was a teacher, and she was the most promising student I could have ever hoped for. After an hour, I went back to the wooden box that held Richard's tools. I reached in and took out another instrument. It was a vintage German drafting compass, made of nickel and steel, perfectly balanced, its needlepoint still lethally sharp. It was not a simple school compass for drawing circles. It was a precision instrument for measuring, for transferring dimensions, for ensuring perfect symmetry. It had been my husband's favorite. I walked back to Ella and held it out to her. "I want you to have this," I said. She looked at it, then at me, her eyes wide. "I can't. That was his. He would want you to have it," I said, closing her hand around its cool, heavy form. "This isn't a toy, Ella. It's a tool for creating, for making sure your lines are true and your foundations are centered. It's a reminder that the most beautiful things are built with precision, with patience, and with purpose." I looked at her, this girl who had navigated an impossible situation with grace and principle. "You don't build a life with inherited money," I told her, my voice quiet but firm. "You build it with the right tools, with a good mind, a true heart, and a steady hand. This is your inheritance, the real one." She clutched the compass, her knuckles white. She didn't cry. She just nodded, her eyes shining with an understanding that went far beyond her years. When she left, the apartment felt different again. It was no longer a blank page. It was a studio, a classroom, a beginning. I walked over to the window and looked down at the park. I saw the parents with their children, the old men playing chess, the students reading on the benches. Soon, they would have a new library, a place of light and quiet and knowledge, a place built on a strong foundation. I picked up my pencil, the graphite smooth and cool against my fingers. I had a lot of work to do, and for the first time in a very long time, I felt truly, completely at peace. A year passed, or maybe it was 2. The calendar pages turned, but I had stopped counting the days in the old way, marked by holidays and birthdays that had become minefields of obligation. Now, my time was measured by progress. The day the foundation for the library was poured, the afternoon the last steel beam was hoisted into place. The morning I first walked through the completed rooms, the air still thick with the smell of fresh paint and sawdust, my apartment transformed with me. The wall I had measured on that first day was now, as I had dreamed, a library. Floor to ceiling shelves of pale, Scandinavian birch filled with books. My books. Richard's books. They were arranged not by color or size, but by subject, by conversation. Philosophy sat next to poetry. History argued with physics. It was a living space, the intellectual heart of my home, and I spent most of my hours there, reading, sketching, and simply thinking. The silence was my companion, a welcome, productive presence. One Tuesday morning, the mail arrived. Bills, a few magazines, and a single cream-colored envelope. I recognized the handwriting instantly. It was Mark's, a tight, backward-slanting script I hadn't seen in years. I felt nothing. No dread, no anger, not even a flicker of curiosity. It was like finding an old, forgotten receipt in a coat pocket, an artifact from a previous life. I took it into my library and sat in my reading chair. The sun streamed through the large window, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air. I slit the envelope open with a silver letter opener. My fingers were steady. The letter inside was 2 pages long, filled with that same cramped script. I read it. It was everything I expected it to be. A predictable cocktail of self-pity, blame, and a clumsy, desperate attempt at remorse. He wrote about his financial struggles, about how Chloe had left him. He wrote about his loneliness. He tried to invoke shared memories, moments from his childhood, twisting them into evidence of a love he now claimed he had never stopped feeling. He said he was sorry, but the apology was hollow, a key he was trying in a lock that no longer existed. He wasn't sorry for what he did. He was sorry for the consequences. He wasn't mourning the loss of a mother. He was mourning the loss of a lifestyle. It was the letter of a stranger, detailing problems I had no interest in solving. When I finished, I didn't tear it up. Tearing it would have been an act of passion, and I had no passion left for him. I didn't file it away. Filing it would have given it importance. Instead, I laid the letter on my knee and folded it carefully in half, then in half again and again, until it was a neat, thick rectangle of paper. I picked up the book I was reading, a biography of the great architect Zaha Hadid. I was on page 247. I slipped the folded letter between the pages, letting a small edge of the cream-colored paper stick out from the top. There, it had found its purpose. The sum of my son's pain and regret was now a bookmark, a minor, functional detail in a much larger, more interesting story. I placed the book on the side table and went to make myself a cup of tea. The past was not burned. It was not buried. It was simply repurposed. My next birthday was a quiet affair. There was no party, no champagne, no towering confection of spun sugar. The day was mine, and I chose to spend it not receiving, but giving. It was the day the Hale Public Library was officially opened to the city. Ella met me on the grand stone steps. She was home from university for the weekend, her face bright with an intelligence and confidence that was all her own. She carried no gift, no card, no bouquet of flowers. Her presence was the only gift I needed. "Happy birthday, grandmother," she said, her smile genuine and warm. "Thank you, my dear," I said, taking her arm. "Shall we go in?" Together, we walked through the great glass doors, and we were met with light. It was exactly as I had designed it. The light was a living thing, pouring in from a vast skylight 2 stories above, reflecting off the pale wood floors and the white walls. It filled every corner of the enormous main reading room, making the space feel boundless, optimistic. There was no oppressive, scholarly silence here. Instead, there was a gentle, productive hum. The whisper of turning pages, the soft tapping of keyboards, the quiet footsteps of people moving between the shelves. It was the sound of a city thinking. We didn't speak. We simply walked. We passed a young mother in the children's wing, sitting under the star-painted dome, reading to her son, who stared up at the constellations with wide, wondrous eyes. We saw a group of students huddled around a large table, their textbooks and laptops spread out, debating a point in low, urgent tones. We saw an old man in a tweed jacket, lost in a newspaper, a small smile on his face. This was my family now. This community of strangers, brought together by a shared search for knowledge, for quiet, for connection. This was the family I had chosen to build. Ella and I found an empty table near a window overlooking the park. We sat, not saying a word, just watching the life of the library unfold around us. A young girl, no older than 10, walked by, her arms full of books. She dropped one, and without a second thought, Ella bent down to pick it up for her. The girl smiled, whispered a thank you, and went on her way. It was a small moment, insignificant perhaps, but in it I saw everything: kindness, grace, a simple, human connection. It was the legacy I had always wanted, but had looked for in the wrong places. It wasn't about bloodlines or inherited wealth. It was about this: building a space where a moment like that could happen. Ella reached across the table and placed her hand over mine. Her hand was warm, her grip firm. She didn't need to say anything. We both understood. This was our celebration. This was our new tradition. Later, as the sun began to set, casting long golden shafts of light through the tall windows, Ella went to find a specific book of poetry she wanted to show me. I stood alone in the center of the great room, watching the light move across the spines of the thousands of books that lined the walls. Each one a voice, each one a world. The rage was gone. The ice had melted, not into a flood of tears, but into a calm, deep river of peace. The woman from that disastrous birthday party, the one who had her heart frozen solid by her son's cruelty, felt like a character in a book I had read long ago. Her story was over. Mine was still being written. Richard used to say that an architect knows any building can be rebuilt, no matter how badly it's been damaged, even a life. The key is to save the foundation. For so long I thought my foundation was my husband, my family, my role as a mother. I was wrong. When all of that was stripped away, I discovered the truth. My foundation was always me.